Welcome to Unbound, the podcast with Beth Curry, author, storyteller, and survivor. This is where books meet real life, where Beth reads chapters from her work and breaks free from the traditional audiobook format, diving deeper into the personal experiences, lessons, and liberation behind every page. Nothing is off limits. Let's get unbound.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to this off-script episode of Unbound. Fair warning, today's episode is dark, really dark, and it was actually a request from a couple of people who are familiar with this part of my story and suggested that I kind of bring it to light a little bit. Not that I need to. I think it's a fairly well-known case. It's the Ken and Barbie killers, Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. I hate saying their names. They don't deserve their names to be spoken. Whatever version of their name exists today. This was one of the most brutal chapters in Canadian criminal history. And it isn't just a true crime story to me. You know, this one's personal. It's uncomfortably, intimately personal to me, as it is to many of my friends, many people in my circle. I have multiple connections to this case, connections that I've barely talked about publicly. They've kind of sat in the corners of my memory for decades, shaping how I understand fear, safety, community, and evil, for sure. Part of why I'm talking about this now is because I've been processing a lot from my teenage years, closing loops and making sense of old anger, and maybe because this still hits a nerve every time I think about the fact that Karla Homolka is free. She has children. Some doofus married her and had babies with her. She raised them in the same community where she helped torture and murder young girls, including her 15-year-old sister, and that is fucking unacceptable. Yeah. I have a visceral reaction when I talk about it. This happened in my neighborhood, my school community, my church community. Leslie lived where I lived. My sister and I believe we had contact with Paul Bernardo. And my mom worked with Leslie's mom on victims of violence services. Evil wasn't distant. It walked the same streets I did. Where I grew up in Burlington. I'm a Blingtown girl, and Burlington was kind of known to be posh and proper and crime-free, and all of this was really friggin' shocking, when it happened. So today I'm talking about Paul and Karla, and about who I believe the real killer was, and why the outcome of this case still feels like an open wound in Canadian justice. I don't even call it a justice system anymore. I call it a legal system, and it is a broken system. When you hear my story in season 3 or read The Other Side of Quiet, you'll understand why my teenage years were really, really fucked up. And this was just one piece of it. So I think most people, unless you've been living under a rock or you were literally born yesterday, know who these people are. In the early 1990s, they were a young, blonde, attractive couple from Southern Ontario. The kind of couple that people labeled Ken and Barbie because they literally looked like Ken and Barbie. And between 1990 and 1992, they sexually assaulted, tortured, and murdered at least 3 young women. Karla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey, and 15-year-old Kristen French. Before meeting Karla, Paul was already the Scarborough rapist. They didn't know it yet. He was responsible for at least 13 sexual assaults between 87 and around 90. And after their arrest, Karla presented herself as a battered spouse forced into participating, and she struck a plea deal. 12 years. 12 years for torture, rape, murder, and her own sister. Paul got life with no parole eligibility for 25 years. He remains in prison. He gets parole hearings all the time, which I would imagine is absolute torture for the families, the victims' families. But it's always denied, and that's good. That's the only good thing that ever seems to continuously happen in Canada. But Karla walked out in 2005. It was the summer. I remember it vividly. Leslie disappeared on June 15th, 1990. She had missed curfew, and she was locked out of her house, and Paul abducted her and held her tortured her, murdered her, dismembered her, set her in concrete, and dumped her in a lake. Her remains were found on June 29th, the same day that Paul and Carla had their fairy tale horse-drawn carriage wedding. Leslie lived in my Brant Hills neighborhood. The same streets I walked, the same places I hung out. She went to my high school, the same community that shaped my adolescence. And she disappeared the night of a memorial service for a friend of mine who was killed in a car accident along with 3 others. While we were grieving one loss or 3 losses, another girl from our neighborhood was being abducted when she went home that night. While we stood in church remembering our friend, Leslie was being tortured. I don't like it. I don't like talking about it. I don't like thinking about it. My sister and I share a memory that we didn't understand until a bit later. We were sitting outside a variety store in our neighborhood, right at Upper Middle Road and Brant Street. And a man pulled up and asked us to get in his car to show him how to get somewhere. We said no. Something in our guts said absolutely not. But when his face hit the news after his arrest, we both kind of reacted instantly. That's him. The timeline fits, the location fits, the tactic fits. This was his known method, asking girls for directions or whatever. The car, the look, the vibe, all of it. We can't prove it, but we both know. The weight of that realization still sits, pretty heavy. We said no. Leslie never got a choice. She was alone. I don't know if that made the difference, but I can guarantee you that her mother and her friends probably tortured themselves. Still. After Leslie's murder, her mom, Debbie, became an advocate for victims of violence. She organized community services, support events, memorials through our church, and my mom helped her organize those events. I attended them. I stood in these rooms and I hugged Debbie Mahaffey many times. This wasn't a distant case I read about on TV. It was my community's grief. It was my friends' grief. It was my high school's grief. My mom and Debbie standing shoulder to shoulder, trying to create meaning out of horror. Kristen French was abducted April 16th, 1992. She was held for 3 days and tortured and murdered. Her body was dumped on a side road beside the cemetery where Leslie Mahaffey is buried. I don't know if, that was deliberate on Paul's part. I wouldn't put it past him to be that disgusting and vile, but anyway, that's the same cemetery, incidentally, where my dad is buried now. But the same side road is where that car accident happened, the one that killed my friend, whose memorial was the night Leslie disappeared. One road, one stretch of geography, multiple tragedies tied together. I've driven that road hundreds of times. When I visit my dad, I visit Leslie, and another friend we lost in 1998 is nearby to her as well. It's creepy to me. One annoying thing, so there was a publication ban. While all of this was unfolding, the court and everything, a publication ban was put on the whole case, and people outside Canada don't realize what that meant. We were not allowed to know a damn thing about what happened. Nothing. No details, no testimony, no context, nothing from the trial. The stated reason was to protect precious Carla's testimony and ensure Paul's trial wasn't contaminated. But what it actually did was protect Carla while she crafted her victim narrative. Meanwhile, American papers were printing everything, and we were all just oblivious up here in Canada. I don't know. I remember picking my dad up at the Ford plant and watching workers stream out with American newspapers tucked under their arms. They passed them around like contraband. Some of the Niagara Falls employees would pick these newspapers up and then bring them into Oakville. My dad would let me read them in the car. I read details that no teenager should ever read, but they were the truth that Canadians weren't allowed to see. What they did to Tammy, what they did to Leslie, what they did to Kristen, and how fully and enthusiastically Carla participated. Even then, the truth was coming from another country. I've never believed Carla's story. I just don't. I believe women. I do. I believe women. But I've never believed her. Not then and not now. Before her, Paul was, and I hate saying it this way, he was just a rapist. He was violent and escalating and dangerous, but he hadn't yet killed anyone during the years he attacked women. After Carla, the murders began. She wasn't coerced. She wasn't terrified. She wasn't passive. There's no fucking way. She escalated the violence. She enabled it. She facilitated it. And the videotapes prove it. Carla drugged her own sister Tammy on Christmas Eve with animal tranquilizers stolen from the vet clinic where she worked. She and Paul raped Tammy while she was unconscious. Tammy choked on her own puke and died. Carla helped stage the scene. She attended the funeral, performing grief. And then she and Paul moved on to their next victim. That's not someone acting out of fear. So sorry, but no. That's someone who's dangerous as hell. People ask me who was worse, Paul or Carla. Well, Paul was already violent, but the murders began with her. That's it. It's the truth. She offered Tammy. She stole the drugs. She lured the victims. She made the girls feel safe. She cleaned up scenes. She manipulated prosecutors the second they were caught, and she presented herself as a battered wife. The tapes proved otherwise, but the deal was already done. She served 12 years and walked out in 2005. Since then, she's changed her name and married and had 3 children. She's built a life in Quebec. The woman who drugged her 15-year-old sister so her boyfriend could rape her is now a mother. She helped torture Leslie Mahaffey, and she's attending parent-teacher conferences. She participated in Kristen French's murder and is grocery shopping like anyone else. Tell me how the hell that is justice. Being a teenage girl in that community during those years was terrifying. Leslie disappeared from my neighborhood. A man who was probably Paul Bernardo tried to get my sister and me into his car. My mom was helping Leslie's mom. The memorial for my friend happened the same night Leslie was taken. All of this overlapped with other shit happening in my life that was already deeply traumatic. Trauma piles on top of trauma. You don't get to choose the order. You just try to survive each new hit. Anyway, I still think about these connections more than I want to. The timing, the geography, the memorial, the side road, cemetery, the variety store. All these threads that wove into the darkest parts of my teenage years. And all I can think about is Carla walking free. Whew. Who was worse, Paul or Carla? Honestly, it doesn't matter. Together they were lethal, Together they fed each other's worst impulses. Together they destroyed lives. But I believe Carla was the catalyst, for sure. The accelerant that turned Paul's violence into murder, and she should still be behind bars. Absolutely. This case is personal in ways I've never talked about so much before. Leslie being from my neighborhood and my possible encounter and just everything, The injustice of Carla walking free still makes me sick. Evil doesn't always look like a monster, Sometimes it looks like a pretty blonde smiling for the cameras. Tammy was 15, Leslie was 14, Kristen was 15. They deserve justice. Their families deserve justice. Never in Canada, though. Thanks for listening to Off Script. Join the conversation in the Facebook group. Support and contact info are in the show notes, and I will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Unbound with Beth Curry. Join the conversation in the Facebook group or visit author.bethcurry.com. Want to support the show? Head to ko-fi.com/unbound podcast. Until next time, stay unbound.